Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Eruvin. We are up to Perik Yud, Mishnah Yud. Today's Mishnayot should be Leilu Nishmat, Neria ben Svetlana, Aranbai ben Eliyahu ben Burcha Yisraelov, Menuchatam beGan Eden, Amen. The Mishnah continues teaching laws that relate to locking a door on Shabbat. One way to lock a door is to take a bolt and insert it into a hole that is next to the door, either in the threshold or the wall, wherever you can see diagram in note 1 brought down in the art scroll elucidated. Now, in certain circumstances, this is prohibited on Shabbat because when one places it in the hole, he is adding to the structure of the house, which is prohibited as a form of building. The next Mishnah cites a dispute as to whether this is a prohibition that's biblical or rabbinic. We will discuss that Bli Neder B'ezrat Hashem in the next Mishnah. However, one may use a utensil, a knife, or a fork as a bolt. Now, since a utensil is not typically used in construction, using it as a bolt is clearly a temporary makeshift measure which does not constitute building. The Mishnah discusses the law of a bolt that can serve as both a bolt and a utensil. Negel sheyesh berosho gilustera. This is the law of a door bolt that has a round knob on its end, which makes it fit for pounding spices. Rabbi Eliezer forbids using it as a bolt, although it can be used as a utensil to pound spices. He says one may not insert it into the threshold or wall of a house because he appears to be making an addition to the house, which is an act of building. Now, since its primary use is as a bolt and not as a spice powder, Rabbi Eliezer rules that it may not be used as a lock on Shabbat. Now, Rabbi Eliezer forbids using the bolt unless it is clearly attached to the door, meaning when not in use, it's tied to the door with a short rope so that it is suspended in the air and does not drag on the ground. Rabbi Eliezer agrees that one may lock the door with a regular utensil, even if it's not tied to the door. He forbids only the type of bolt that we discussed here, which is a bolt that can also be used as a utensil. This is how the art's elucidated notes explain it. The Rabbi Yossi matir, but Rabbi Yossi permits using it since it is a utensil of sorts. One who uses it as a bolt does not even appear to be building. And the Rav does tell us, V'alachak Rabbi Yossi, the halakha follows the opinion of Rabbi Yossi. Amar Rabbi Eliezer said, citing evidence for his opinion, Maaseh b'knesset shebitveria shayu no'ogin bo heter. It happened that there was a bolt with a knob on its end in a synagogue in Tveria, and the people there would treat it as permitted, meaning they would use it on Shabbat to lock the door. Ad sheba Rabban Gamliel v'askenim v'asru lahen, until Rabban Gamliel came with the elders and prohibited them to do so. Therefore, Rabbi Eliezer says we see that using such a bolt is forbidden. However, Rabbi Yossi responds, Rabbi Yossi says that the opposite occurred. Isur na'agu. They would treat it as forbidden, meaning they would not use it to lock the door. Ba Rabban Gamliel v'askenim v'yitziru lahen. Rabban Gamliel came with the elders and permitted them to use it. And that is the end of Mishnah Yud. Mishnah Yud Aleph now discusses a bolt that does not have a knob and therefore has no use other than locking the door. The previous Mishnah spoke of a bolt with a knob at its end. Now, like we said, our Mishnah discusses a bolt that does not have a knob and therefore has no use other than locking a door. Neger hanigrar, if a plain bolt which lacks a knob is tied to a door with a rope, but the rope is so long that the bolt drags on the ground, meaning the entire bolt or just part of it lies on the ground when not in use. No'alim bo b'mikdash, we may lock the door with it in the temple, avalo b'medina, but not in the rest of the country, meaning anywhere outside the temple. And the commentators explain, since the bolt drags on the ground, not everyone will notice that it is already attached to the door. The rabbis therefore prohibited one to lock a door with it on Shabbat because one seems to be adding something new to the structure. Now, if the commentators explain, if the bolt were not tied to the door at all, using it would be biblically forbidden as an act of building, because when one inserts it into the hole in the wall or the threshold, he is adding it to the structure. Now, this is like driving a nail into a wall, which is a biblical melacha. Now, this follows the view that the melacha building includes even changes that are only temporary. However, If the bolt is tied to the door, there is no biblical violation, since it was already designated for locking the door and it was attached to the structure of the house for that purpose before Shabbat. Using it on Shabbat does not fundamentally change the structure of the house. Therefore, its use is biblically permitted. But the rabbis ruled that it does not suffice for the bolt to be tied to the door. Rather, it must also be suspended in the air, meaning tied with the short ropes that when not in use, it hangs entirely above the ground. If it drags, meaning all or part of it touches the ground, onlookers might not realize that it's tied to the door, and they will think that one who uses it is doing a biblical melacha. The rabbis therefore required that the bolt not only be tied, but also suspended entirely in the air. Now this applies to a regular bolt which does not have a knob. Using a bolt that does have a knob is permitted, according to Rabbi Yossi in the previous Mishnah, even if it is not attached to the door at all. V'amunach kan v'chan asur. The Mishnah says, however, if the bolt is not tied to the door at all, but just rests on the ground, using it is forbidden both in the temple and outside the temple, because in this case, where the bolt is not attached to the door at all, its use is a biblical melacha. Now, just to go back on the previous point, I missed out to explain that even though the rabbis prohibited one to lock a door with that plain bolt which lacks a knob on Shabbat, its use is permitted in the temple, because like many other rabbinic decrees pertaining to Shabbat, this one does not apply in the temple. Now, generally, the rabbis do not apply their Shabbat decrees to activities that contribute toward the temple service, and we will discuss this b'li neder b'ezrat Hashem in the remaining Mishnayot of this chapter. Now, continuing what we were saying, v'amunach kan v'chan asur, if the bolt is not tied to the door at all, but just rests on the ground, using it is forbidden both here in the temple and here outside the temple, because in this case, where the bolt is not attached to the door at all, its use is a biblical melacha, and therefore one may not lock a door with it even in the temple. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, however, Rabbi Yehuda rules leniently. He says, hamunach mutar b'mikdash, if the bolt rests on the ground, meaning it's not tied to the door, it is rabbinically forbidden, and therefore it's permitted in the temple, but not anywhere else. Now the Rav explains, according to Rabbi Yehuda, locking a door with the bolt is never a biblical transgression, because the melacha of building does not pertain to something such as a bolt that's meant to be removed at any time. The rabbis, however, forbade using a bolt only because it resembles an act of building, and since the prohibition is only drabanan rabbinic, it does not apply in the temple. Vanigra b'medina, and if it drags on the ground, meaning if it is tied to the door, but all or part of it touches the ground, it is permitted in the rest of the country, meaning even outside the temple. Now, a bolt that is tied to the door was already installed as part of the structure before Shabbat, like we explained earlier. Rabbi Yehuda rules that this suffices for it to be completely permitted, even if it drags on the ground. However, the Tana Kama, like we said earlier, says you can only lock the door with such a bolt in the temple, but not anywhere outside the temple. And the Rav does tell us, V'alacha Rabbi Yehuda, the halacha follows the lenient view of Rabbi Yehuda. That is in the Rabotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen v'amen.